Today I'm going to try to show one of the ways, certainly not the only way, but one of the ways you can polish up a brake master cylinder. So on the modern bikes that have a remote reservoir, sometimes it's appropriate just to polish up the aluminum cap. On the old RDs, they're made out of composite stuff, so really not a lot you can do with them. And on our latest project on the risers, we've polished up the caps and polished up what amounts to be the new risers. We've already test ridden this bike. It's really nice. Notice there's no key. Well, because I made a special extra long key. I'll show that somewhere on the video. And whether it's the clutch or whether it's the brake cylinder, master cylinder, doing a little polishing on it, a very quick, I call it quick and dirty, little modification you can make to dress up the bike for almost no money. And it's especially good if you have the brake system apart for any reason and the hydraulic fluid drained out of it. It makes it even easier. So what I have is from the Evil Twin project. I have a spare master cylinder that I'm going to polish up today, and I thought that would be a good subject for today's video. But we have literally hundreds of videos on polishing things on our channel, Windy U. Windy, it's a space U, by the way, not just Windy U. Important, anytime I'm working with brake fluid, I always try to wear rubber gloves. I don't want that on my hands. And I always try to protect all the paint where the brake fluid might drip or drool. Now, there's actually three parts I want to take care of in this little project. I want to clean this up and paint it shiny black. This is the cover that goes by the forks. Separate piece. I want to pull this rubber boot off. I want to have that in stock for when I reinstall this. It will not be with this brake line. It'll be with another brake line. And this is the main thing now. I want it to block off where the brake fluid might be dripping out. I have to put some tape or something there temporarily while I take this over to the sink and drain out all the brake fluid. Now, a good tip for whenever you want to get pieces like this off where it's going over something oversized, always warm it up. This way you avoid either damaging it or tearing it or whatever. The heat, of course, softens up the rubber. Now, I don't intend to use this brake line over, but I always have a bucket full of these brake lines for obvious reasons. There it goes. Woo! And the brass washers, you can anneal. You can heat them cherry red, let them cool. The aluminum ones, you just replace. The first part that I want to get off of here, and I want to save the bolts. We'll polish the bolts up, of course. I want to take this apart. This will be the first part. I can run over to the buffing wheel. Just this has already got a reasonably nice finish on it. We can buff that up. Now I always want to make sure I'm polishing from the bottom of the wheel down. I don't want to be here and this part jumps up and hits me in the nose. And just with about a minute and a half of buffing, we have the first part cleaned up and ready for our little upgrade. Now this, of course, is one of the parts you're going to see all the time that you're riding the motorcycle, so I want to have this. That's our first part. I hope that's going to be one of the nice little parts that I'm going to see every time I ride the bike. Now the cap on many motorcycles, you can just take the cap off and polish it, but one of the requirements here is not to get any residual grinding compound down into if you're going to leave the brake fluid in there, we're going to flush this all out, so it won't really matter, but we don't want to get any in there if we don't have to anyway. And sometimes this little, and that brake fluid's probably 20 years old, but we'll take care of that too. Now, I want to take this out very, very carefully. I don't want to rip it or tear it. And anytime I would ever take anything apart, I just run over to the buffing wheel, run these on a buffing wheel just a little bit. Just makes one more nice little detail touch on any restoration project. As I'm putting these parts together, I want to clean them up. Good old simple green. Clean this up as much as possible, because we'll be putting fresh brake fluid in this, of course, when we're done. Line up the parts one by one as I'm working on them. I just get a sense of, I like to see the parts nice and clean before I do anything. Our little cover, you probably could run over and just buff it, but it's got a bunch of little nicks and dings in it that I'm going to try to get some of them out anyway. Some 1000 grit paper and some soapy water. And what's nice about doing these projects this time of year, this is a project I can do in the cellar. I don't have to be out in the freezing cold shop to do most of this. Now after sanding, I want to take a little bit of SOS. Since there were a lot of little chips, kind of nicks things in this that you don't see until you clean off all the oxidation. Once I clean this up a little bit, I'll run this over to the buffing wheel. Notice another thing, what I'm doing with this, that it's just my way of doing things, is I always do the smaller parts first to get my, I don't know what, my rhythm going, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, little by little, that's cleaning up nice. Now for a job like this, one of the things that's very handy to have, and these are, you can see the grid on them, these are under $5 at Harbor Freight. You need a little mandrel, which you can buy separately. And they basically just screw right on. For the purpose of this, where we do have some scratches and some imperfections, we're going to use the 120 grit. This is the finest of the grits they make. And people who visit the shop or come to work on some of their projects, they immediately notice that I have a lot of Harbor Freight stuff in here. And these are exceptionally good. Now they have a little screw in the back, and of course this is what happens. I really can't show this, one second, the way I wanted to. Anyway, it's hard to do this with one hand, need the other hand free, but anyway, they have a little thread on the back. You basically put it in, that thread catches on a little mandrel, and they sell the mandrel separate. And these work the best I've found on aluminum, and when you run them at very high speeds. In fact, that one looks like, let me just see something. Looks like it's crooked for some reason. Maybe I didn't get it on there straight. It should not be wiggling around too much. And again, what these are good for, there's little tiny imperfections along the edge. Good idea to wear gloves if you're doing this, because if you touch that with your bare hand, it'll definitely do some damage to your skin, unless you're an alligator. And this will be the equivalent of sanding with a block. Just get rid of any high spots we still have left on here. And the scratches that are on there will come out with the compound. Good idea to have the heavy old motorcycle gloves, because this part is going to get pretty hot from the buffing operation. And this is really one of the nicest things to have, of these fur, again, Harbor Freight. You buy it, what happens is you buy a mandrel, it comes with a couple of other pads. But the one you find the best at the end of a buffing operation, when everything is really nice and shiny already, this puts the final touch on, and it's also fine to use this with paint. No compound, just the way it is. Now, it's always good to keep in mind that polishing all metal is, I think, more of an art than a science. Different metals have different hardnesses, castings, extrusions. Soft metal, the softer aluminums, the machinable aluminums, aircraft aluminum, all polish up just a little different. So what's always good to do is, and this is the reason I say, do the little parts first. Basically, these are all going to be castings, so they're all very similar. But if we had a part that was not a casting, you'd have to do a little experiment. But in this case, this part buffed up just about as nice as you could expect. We add that to our little lineup, move on to the next part. Next item in sequence of how I figure how difficult they are. This, of course, is a casting also, should polish up exactly the same. One bolt takes it out. But almost every master cylinder I've ever worked on also has a little mechanism for shutting off, turning on the stoplight. So I've already taken the loose parts out. I want to be careful not to lose any of the little parts that come out of there when I take the lever off. I'm not sure we're going to use this brake line or not use it, but while I have it off, running it on a buffing wheel, you can pretty much see that in about 30 seconds, it looks a lot nicer than the one that isn't polished. And that's the whole idea of everything here is while you have something apart, you may as well polish the bolts, polish the screws, polish the brake ends, do anything you can to, and obviously you don't want to get any compound down in there, down inside the brake line. If you do, flush it out. And of course, while I have it apart, got all the bolt heads polished and the spring that goes around the brake line. So that's ready. And we're ready for the doing that lever. So the first thing with the lever, now a lot of these levers have that clear coating that a lot of manufacturers put on them. So I have to find out if I have that coating on there. See, it looks relatively shiny, but it's not really shiny. That's that clear coat, I think, that's on there. So the first step, let's see if we have a coating on these. Now some have that clear coating like some Chevy parts do. And I know the side covers of a lot of Yamahas and Suzukis and Kawasaki's. And the way you know if you have that coating, if this turns black right away, you're sanding aluminum. This is 2000 grit, Rhino wet. Yeah, it looks like they don't have anything on here. Now who knew? You never know. But before you can polish aluminum, you got to get that coating off. Now, and I have not found any paint remover that takes it off. Realistically, acetone, none of the chemicals, a torch doesn't take it off. So what I'm saying is if you have it on, there's one way to get it off, grind it off. Grinding or sanding will always take it right off. So I'm going to carefully, with 2000 grit, just sand this before I buff it. Look for any flaws. A lot of times they're all chewed up on the end from dropping a bike. You can clean it all up as much as you can. And we'll buff this out. And then we're on to the final part. One thing a lot of people underestimate is even if you didn't buff parts with a buffing wheel and compound, one of the things you can do that's really pretty easy with most aluminum, and I've seen this, once you get that coating off, you can do it to even to side covers of motorcycles and old British bikes. The aluminum parts, they respond well. This is just ordinary SOS. And even that'll put a halfway nice shine on it. Maybe not quite as good. It's 90% as what you could do with a buffing wheel, but if you don't have a buffing wheel, this is a good second choice. Now the nice thing about any buffing, whether you're buffing paint, polishing aluminum, whatever you're doing, what happens, it's a skill that's very easy to learn. You pick it up quickly. The tricks are, and we've got it on plenty of the other videos, get it flat, get it smooth, get it shiny, and it'll stay that way for a really long time. And when you go to reshine it, it'll be a very minimum, little bit of silver polish. I call it silver polish. It's really any of the Meguiar's polishes or the polishes that are made for aluminum, they work just fine on this. Minimum of work to keep it looking shiny for many, many years. Now you might notice I saved the biggest, most complex piece for last, and there's a couple of things to consider. before you do that part of the master cylinder. But this gets me in a good feel for how these parts are going to buff out, how they're going to polish up. Now I'm ready to do the most complex part. Now one of the things I want to do, and you could take this apart. I found that in the past, if you don't have to take these apart, there's really no reason to. They really do last a long time. And you just create problems. This is going to be the plug. I'm going to cut this real carefully to protect the plunger while I'm buffing it. And I've drained the master cylinder. I've taped this end up so that we don't tend to hurt this surface where it has to seal. I need the plunger, and I know this works fine. I've had this on a motorcycle that I've been using, so I know this works. We're not going to do a rebuild kit on it. That plug will seal up the plunger. This will seal this up, and just to keep, it's not going to matter if we repolish the top a little bit. But look at this right away. This already tells me, this is what brake fluid does to paint, by the way. Anybody that's never dripped brake fluid on paint. But it looks like, it has the look to me like this is some kind of aftermarket paint that may just come off with either acetone or paint remover. We may have lucked out here, I don't know. Now, it's been a lucky day here, it looks like, because I took a little acetone, just ordinary acetone, and it's taking the paint right off. It's softening, it's like acting like paint remover. So I'm going to very carefully and diligently do this with a lot less effort than if I had to grind it off with sandpaper. And this may be, I don't know, I don't think this is the factory paint, but again, I don't know the history of this bike going way back. It's not like a bike I owned since it was new. But if you see the rag turning that color, the color that you're taking off, and you can get your fingernail under there, you can do it with very, very little effort. This is a really good tip because some of these finishes and factory finishes are not going to come off this easily. I have a feeling somebody just painted this with barbecue paint or something. But even that, if you let that acetone just soak a second, watch. This is a soft wire brush, not a hard one. Takes most of it off. Go back with paper towel. May have to go through this cycle a few times, but basically we're going to get, it looks like we're going to be able to get off all of that finish. Now, the reason for using a soft wheel, I don't want to have any deep scratches, because I'm going to have to sand and polish this. I don't want to have to get out any of the scratches. I don't have to. And every time, just go back, wipe it, that softens up the paint, whatever's the residual left there. Little by little, we'll get the whole part clean. So it's very nice that the acetone helped take that paint off, but from this point on, you can see we have a lot of casting flaws in here. This is not a real, this is the reason they paint parts flat black at the factory. They don't want to go by and finish these surfaces. I want to finish all the flat surfaces that you see as nicely as possible, so that, and actually here I'll probably grind off this word lower because it's going to be a rough casting under there, and try to do a lot of this I'm going to have to do by hand, some I can do with the machine. Again, I can see the difference between, this is the rough pad, this is the soft pad, and because this part has very, very deep flaws, we're going to use the rough pad in the very beginning, and then use the smooth pad to get out the flaws. And you can see there's some of the flaws in this are pretty deep. There's casting flaws here. So let me just demonstrate this. I've already worked this side just to see how long, and I needed the rough pad, let's put it that way. Or I'd wind up using a box of the soft pads. It's a good idea to move the part so all the scratches that we're going to have to get out later with the buffing wheel are going to be in different directions, if possible. This makes it a little bit easier for you. Now, if you look at, of course, we're going to have to get rid of those scratches. The difference in the finish, or side that we haven't done yet. And the bottom of this we're really not going to see. I'm not going to give it too much work. Just get a light polish on it. But the parts that I'm going to see, I'd like to really do nicely. Now, next thing will be to do it with the soft, the little pad, the soft one. I think you can see it out here in the clean room. You just can see that we'll do all the sides. And then ultimately we have to get out all the scratches either by hand, buff and wheel, or we can start by using a soft pad. Now what's going to happen, a fine pad will get out some of the scratches, but not all. I'm going to show the difference in this. Even with the fine pad, you still do have scratches that have to be taken out. Now, you can take this out with the buffing wheel and just keep buffing and buffing and buffing. Or we can do some sanding on this. The sanding will make 10 minutes of sanding will save an hour of buffing. And this is always one of the steps you tend to try to leave out the scratches that are in there, even from the fine pad. Now, these will come out with some 2000 grit. Some of them will. And if I spend 10 minutes here on this part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save a lot more than that in time standing by the buffing wheel. And it should get out a lot of the scratches. It's just time consuming. That's the only problem with all of this. It's not like you can do this in some real one-step way. And in fact, I know because I've tried in the past, just not doing any of these prep things and just holding a buffing wheel against the part for a half an hour and seeing if it would shine. And eventually, yeah, it does, but boy, it takes forever. Now that's still got some scratches, but the rest of these we can get out with the buffing wheel. And this is the part that's going to be time consuming for sure, but it'll be very rewarding too. A couple of really good tips that might not be obvious. Anytime you're working on a buffing wheel, see how dirty the shirt gets? Put it right in the laundry. Don't put it in with your wife's good stuff or your tuxedo or something. Now I worked on this a little bit before. We still need to get some scratches out, but it's really coming out pretty nice. And of course I'll little by little get the whole piece, all the parts that you're going to see to be as smooth, and I think that's great. And I do like, it's really a personal thing for me, I do like having just easier to work on and nicer to wipe off and everything. I do like having highly polished surfaces. Now as I finish this up, today's little project, and what I always like to do is if I can add a nice detail touch or a custom touch to a motorcycle for almost no money, a very little amount of time, and the result that I did it rather than buying it in a store and letting somebody in some foreign country get rich. Now I got to take this off, of course, and the only thing left here is to just get this off, and we're ready to put it on a motorcycle. So that ends our project for today, and what I hope is it's giving you some thoughts, some ideas how you can do these type of things. Polishing up anything made out of aluminum or steel can always be very rewarding. Hope you enjoyed the video. That part really came out nice. It's really going to add a nice touch to wherever we decide to install it. The lever. Again, these are all things you can do on your own, and I always think we're going to paint this black, of course, shiny black. All of these parts, and I always get a special satisfaction out of knowing this is polished when you go to work on it. Just so much nicer. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. And don't forget, we have, I think it's coming up on 1100 on YouTube right now. Windy Space U. Thanks for watching. Now, I almost forgot to include this. This was something I'm working on. I'll finish this up in the next day or so. It's that extended key. I made a carbon fiber extension for it. I need to finish it, buff it. That's coming up on the next video. Anyway, again, thanks for watching.